Welcome again, guys. Before we dwell into the topic of utility theory, we first need to read some history of economic thought that created the right theoretic chain for the theory to be cultivated. The discovery of modern utility theory in economic thought will go as far back around the 1870s, where three major economists proposed a new view to combat the previous labor theory of value, or simply LTV. These three economists were William Stanley Jevons, Leon Warlus, and Karl Menger. To understand the distinction between the new theory versus the old one, we will first concur to LTV. There were two major definitions of LTV in the 19th century, one from the group of Adam Smith and David Ricardo, and the other from Karl Marx. Smith's and Ricardo's definition of value relied on the notion of just labor. However, their definition of value labor was abstract because they knew that labor itself is not everything, as some labor is not fruitful, but they did not know any better. While Marx's definition of LTV was that labor was just one part of it, he added that the time that one spent on labor was the main point. This means that more time spent on laboring means that the laborer is more valuable. This was and is very controversial because that is not always necessary. One can spend more time doing something that could take less time and the result is the same. That does not mean that suddenly the final product with more labor has more value to the consumer. Instead, the consumer will opt for the good that is of good value to their point of view. Additionally, there could be a product or service which took long labor to make. If the object is not valuable to anyone, then the product does not matter how much labor it went into the product. The end result is that the object has no value. The empirical implication of a special or exclusive productivity of labor would be that and harder would have higher outputs and higher standards of living. The reality, however, is that the countries whose input are less labor and more entrepreneurship tend to have vastly higher standards of living, including shorter hours of their workers. This is a quote from Thomas Sowell, a 20th century big economist. And indeed, if we look at the GDP per hour worked, a measure of labor productivity normalized to purchasing power parity, is much higher in such countries as are real average wages. Both measures have increased over time. More on this later when we discuss measurements. New era begun with the notion that goods and services do not have value because labor has value. Rather, labor has value because goods and services labor bring value to the consumers. The shift was made from valuing the labor itself to the consumer valuing the goods and services labor. Janoffs and Menger were working on the notion of utility-based theory of price. Surprisingly, they all came to a similar conclusion of marginal utility theory of value. Later, Walras came up with the derivation of demand through the utility theory. Jevons formulated the theory of exchange, and he got his motivation from Daniel Bernoulli. In fact, Kramer and Bernoulli had formulated the concepts of expected utility and decreasing marginal utility, which we will discuss later. Thereby, mathematics were the real founders of utility theory, as they formulated that utility of money decreases as a person's wealth increases. The explanation will come in the next videos. On top of that, Janoffs expressed that the value depends entirely on utility, and many economists afterwards agreed with that. This new introduction of marginalized economics, a new generation of economists emerged called the marginal economists that brought the marginal revolution in the field of economics. This was a quick introduction to the history of utility theory In the next videos, we will discuss the actual theory from an introductory perspective. Thank you for watching.